Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, 2021 FDD Update Strategies for a COVID World. This is the next installment of Manning Fulton's Franchise Feed webinar series, designed to provide you, as franchise executives, with relevant, actionable guidance on how to grow and protect your brand as you navigate these challenging times. My name is Carly Smith, and I am a Manning Fulton franchise attorney. As one of the leading franchise practices, Manning Fulton's experienced practitioners focus daily on helping each client grow and develop their brand through franchising. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Ritchie Taylor. In addition to his substantial experience in corporate and commercial transactions, Ritchie founded and leads the firm's franchise practice, where he serves as the primary franchise counsel to hundreds of established and emerging franchisors, franchisees, and dealer networks. He has decades of experience helping domestic and international franchisors design and grow their franchise systems. Ritchie is a recognized thought leader in franchising across the Carolinas and nationally. He is actively involved in the International Franchise Association as a longtime member of the IFA membership and legal and legislative committees. Ritchie also serves on the IFA Supplier Board of Directors and is a member of the IFA's Emerging Franchisor Task Force. Additionally, as one of the first franchise attorneys in private practice to receive the Certified Franchise Executive, or CFE, designation, he went on to serve on the CFE Board of Directors. Ritchie is highly involved in the North Carolina Bar Association Business Law Section and is the founding chair of the North Carolina Bar Association Committee on Franchising. He's a frequent presenter at the IFA and other franchise functions. In this webinar, Ritchie will guide you through today's topic to better understand how you can strategically use the franchise disclosure document update process to position your brand for success with both prospective and existing franchisees in the new post-COVID franchise business cycle. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions panel of the control panel. You may submit questions at any time during this presentation, which questions I will collect for our presenter to address at the end of the program. If we are unable to address your question during the session, we'll contact you afterwards to discuss. Today's program will be recorded, and in the coming days, you will receive a shareable link to view the program, which can be also accessed with other resources at www.franchisefeed.net. Now I turn the time over to Ritchie for today's program.
Thank you, Carly. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us today to talk about the state of franchising out there and what you can do as part of your FDD update to best position your franchise system to tell your story. Today, we hope to accomplish three things. We want to talk about what the state of franchising and the franchising marketplace looks like, an overview of strategies that successful franchisors are implementing in order to position their brands for success, and how you can use your 2021 FDD to tell your epic story. 2020 was a year that Homer and the other Greek tragic writers could only have dreamed of, and so every one of us has been through an epic odyssey of our own. And so it's time now in your 2021 FDD to tell that story. One constant theme from 2020, and will be no different in 2021, is change, radical change in franchising, radical change in how we do business. Eric Hoffer said a long time ago, in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. And that could not be more true than where we sit 9 months after COVID first was unleashed on us and our businesses and the economy and our health. So strategy moving forward. If your businesses have changed, you're doing things differently than how you're doing them. Some of those things, how you were doing them historically. Some of those things will stay. Some of those things may go as we move past COVID. It's time in your FTD to tell the story, and in your operations and other places, how your system has evolved, how it's changed, to sit down and think critically about what are those, as you move past COVID, what are those things that are going to be part of your system that are to be here to stay, and to be telling that story and being able to tell the story to the your prospective franchisees of how you reacted to COVID, how you reacted to these circumstances, and how you led your brand successfully through to the other side. The next question from a strategic perspective is who stays and who goes. I don't mean that to sound blunt, but that is a decision that has to get made as far as dealing with your franchise system. And the overarching goal of your franchise system has been and will be to save those units that can be saved. There are many that can be saved and can come out on the other side, and it behooves you not only to help your franchisees and to be able to have that success story of being able to have those franchisees come out successfully on their side, but it behooves you to preserve those units, if they can be preserved, to be able to fly your flag and to be able to be successful outlets. Ways that can be accomplished that is, and franchisors have been using, is providing some kind of temporary financial assistance where appropriate. Obviously, there are government stimulus programs out there, to be aware of those, of how the successful PPP program has worked, and now Congress just made further changes to that and expanded that PPP program, and many of your franchisees may be eligible for that program. The doors for that program opened up this week, and so becoming aware and helping your franchise community become aware of how they can tap those resources and be able to have the working capital that they need to be able to make it successfully to the other side of this pandemic. There may be some units that can't be saved with the existing operator. Helping facilitate transfers to stronger operators or new operators would behoove you versus simply having those close. Some brands, what we saw in the last recession is that some brands would provide incentives to buyers, to stronger buyers, to help encourage them to take on these units, to partnering with them in either royalty concessions or other tools to be able to get those operators to do that. Some of those may already be in your system. Stronger operators who are willing to make an investment either together or in a more club or syndicate approach to be able to take over some of those locations. Consider even having your internal sales force not charge a commission or brokerage commission for making that placement. Is worth, when you sit there and you think about your royalty stream and what the value of those units are to you, making some of these concessions in order to keep a unit alive is a great investment for a franchisor to make, even if that involves perhaps having to put some money in order to make that transition be successful. Over supporting your franchisees and helping stabilize them. That's that's been the message for the last 9 months, and will continue to be as we seek to make it through to the other end of this crisis. Now, there may be some units that can't be saved with that current operator, or can't be saved without going through a bankruptcy process. Historically, we as franchise lawyers would want to make sure that that agreement is terminated upon bankruptcy, and most of your franchise agreements most certainly provide for that. There may be strategic situations, though, where it makes sense to allow and consent to the transfer through bankruptcy, allowing that franchise unit to pass through bankruptcy through what was called a 363 sale to a surviving, well-capitalized, approved franchisee. So helping the debtor in that situation to identify potential stalking horse bidders who are willing to step up and make a bid that you would approve would help you not have to be the buyer, and help you to be in the driver's seat to make sure that the people that you are that are being approach your system are people that you want to be having join your system. Now, I've been doing this long enough to see these cycles, and people who've been in franchising long enough to see these cycles. And franchising, to a lot of degree, franchising is a counter-cyclical business as far as franchise development is concerned. And the conditions are ripe, believe it or not, that I think that we have the conditions right for a super cycle in franchising. There's lots of pent-up demand for franchise development. We started to see inclinations of that demand of people taking action the last half of 2020. The first half, people were still in hunkering down mode, but we're starting to see that ice thaw. You see people with the realization that they're not going to get reemployed anytime soon, and they need to make a decision of what they're going to do, and look at other alternatives. You see people that are in their jobs that are dissatisfied with their jobs. We still have an extremely accommodative Federal Reserve policy and governmental policy that is most certainly encouraging for environment, despite the economic headwinds, is an encouraging environment for borrowing. So these are all, and of course, a record high stock market that could, help result in 401k rollovers and other liquidity events for prospective franchisees to be able to get into the franchising game. So and plus, when you look at the marketplace, there are going to be a shakeout of competitors that are competing for those prospective franchisees. So the strong that survive this are going to survive and thrive even stronger. Are the digital platforms that we have developed, that you've developed in your systems, the remote delivery of services, the mobile apps, those kind of things are here to stay. And we talk about bricks and clicks and omni-channel distribution, and that still remains true. I mean, there's a reason that Amazon is opening up physical locations as the preeminent e-commerce company. They recognize the need to have physical locations, and that's not going to change. COVID has made everyone lean and mean in their business operations with lots of innovation that has occurred. Necessity is the mother of invention, they say, and that is no different here with with COVID. And so the brands, as they come out, what we're seeing is that they're coming out with leaner and meaner and with enhanced competitive advantages to be able to deliver to these prospective franchisees. So as I said, we've each could write a novel on what we have been through in 2020. So telling your brand story, your 2021 FDD is the opportunity to tell your brand story of 2020, how you and your leadership have led through that, and what this brand looks like on the other end. It's how have your units fared, your unit count, as it dropped, have you been able to maintain it? That's quite an accomplishment to be able to maintain it or maintain any semblance of what it was for systems. And so, that is going to be reflected in item 20 of your FDD. Item 19 of your FDD, I'm going to speak in more detail of that, are your financial performance representations or earnings claims, how those have been impacted. It's the time to sit down and extract trends and other indicators of rehabilitation and recovery. The nice thing about COVID, if there is such a thing, is that it was experienced by everyone, and every brand in your sector has probably had a similar experience, although you may have even exceeded what your sector did. So the ability to show how your brand was perhaps more resilient than others in your sector is going to be helpful in differentiating your brand as you seek to communicate your message to potential franchise purchasers. So what things should you be doing now from a business perspective? You should be reevaluating your real estate strategy. Do you need as much real estate as you have historically had? Can you redesign your footprint to do more with less, or do you need more space in order to provide for adequate social distancing? All those things are things to be looking at markets that you might have been too expensive for you to have historically opened up in, but that perhaps the real estate market is becoming more favorable for tenants. To enhance your lead generation strategies, to work on franchisee validation. There's a lot of goodwill that brands have built up that franchisors have built up with their franchisees last year in helping them through this crisis. And so it's time to cash in on that goodwill and be able to document those validation stories and be able to share those with prospective franchisees to understand how the soft side of what you do and how you approach franchising and how you partner with your franchisees, and documenting success stories and publishing them, and getting that human interest story out there, going ahead and getting that lead generation out there so that when your leads are looking for validation, they're going to know where to find it. Like, it's going to be out there available for them to find it. And recognizing that nurturing leads may be different due to changes in candidate demographics. I mean, we have an interesting situation where roughly half of those looking for franchise right now are probably baby boomer generation, but that means the other half aren't. So you're seeing a changing of the guard with regards to lead generation and closing. So these are going to be younger franchisees. They may have different interests and motivating factors, and being able to figure out how to tap into that. What we have been seeing as well is we've been seeing situations where the generation Z might be partnering with their baby boomer parents to get into business together. So you've got multi-generational franchisees, and so there are different needs to be able to speak to in your franchise sales process. Operational strategies. How are you going to implement virtual engagement during the development cycle? Everyone has been doing that to some degree or another. We had a great program earlier a few weeks ago on our franchisefeed.net website, talking about virtual discovery days, and have you found them to be beneficial to your franchisees? Is that something that you want to continue doing? Implementing virtual training, whether it's Zoom, combination of Zoom, teleconferences like we're doing here, recorded programs, or formal learning management systems. This may help, both of these things may help your franchisees feel more comfortable, your prospects feel more comfortable with engagement as we move away from the pandemic, but they may be unsure about attending live meetings. But it also has a benefit of reducing the development costs for both the franchisor and the franchisee, when you don't have to put people on planes to be able to come back and forth and stay in hotels, and both sides have been historically doing both in the development process. That leads to more profitable development process for the franchisor, and it leads for reduced cost for the franchisee. And these conference calls and virtual conferences, are those going to remain part of your system or not, or in addition to perhaps live events? But these are all things to be thinking about, and so that you can think about how you can tell your story of how you're going to be supporting your franchisees and distinguishing your brand. In other operational strategies, building goodwill with the system while making the franchisees better operators. Franchisees are looking for how to better manage and preserve their cash flow. They're looking for best practices in that. Their historical practices may or may not be working. Being able to share those best practices among your existing franchisees is a net positive that was greatly appreciated, and in turn is a pain point for franchise systems that are not providing this kind of financial management information. Informing franchisees about government stimulus programs, as we talked about earlier, that's a low cost opportunity to be able to not only fortify your franchise system, but build a huge level of goodwill with your franchisees. Now, many systems have had to implement temporary protocols. I mean, in every business, I can't think of one where you wouldn't have to wear a mask, or perhaps there's hand sanitizer around the office, or around greeting you as you walk into an establishment. Now, some of these protocols have resulted in changes to your temporary changes or modifications to your system standards. And it may be necessary to further modify those in 2021, or start to roll those back and move forward with perhaps a permanent modified standard of how you do business. So it's important to document the temporary nature of these modifications, and then use what we call the new day letter to let people know that, hey, we have permitted a variance with regards to X, Y, and Z standards, but that variance will be no longer permitted on, May 31st or whatever the date may be, so that you are clearly documenting that you have not waived your right to enforce those standards in a longer term horizon. Now, moving on, talking about the FDD update and where you should be thinking about from an FDD perspective. When we approach an FDD update with our clients, we're always looking at 4 things. One is to address items that are required to be changed. There's certain items of the FDD that must be updated each year. To address changes in the system that the franchisor intends to implement. To address feedback from franchise prospects. There may be provisions that are pain points in the franchise sales process, and discuss, are those really necessary, or do they or could they be worded differently, or how could there be another way to address the concern raised by the franchise prospects? And then lastly, to address changes in the law. So every franchisor has to update their disclosure document at least annually, and that depends between 90 to 120 days from the end of their fiscal year, depending on what states they are registered to sell franchises in. Additionally, they may have to update their FDD quarterly or more frequently if there's a material change in the disclosure document. And a material change is one that is likely to impact a prospective franchisee's investment in that business opportunity. That FDD, those mid-year amendments have to be done quarterly from a federal perspective, or promptly within 30 days, typically after the occurrence of a material change that would impact, that a franchisee would want to know about in making an investment decision. Here are some examples of when an amendment might be required more frequently than annually. Changes in management, changes in a large departure in the number of outlets that you have, changes in your franchise agreement, changes in your cost structure, among others. So you will want to be aware of those in the event, as you go through this year, there are changes that might precipitate an amendment even more frequently than your typical annual amendment that you might be used to. So questions to consider in deciding whether in your FDD update. Has your franchise system changed how it delivers its goods and services? And have local law and our safety guidelines impacted how you conduct business? I'm just going to go through many of the items in the FDD and how they might be impacted by answering those 2 questions. So first relates to risk factors. The various registration states have been eliminating the historical crazy quilt of risk factors that they would implement, and instead are trying to move towards a uniform set of risk factors written uniformly and applied uniformly among franchise brands. And what we had last year was the first year many of these were implemented. The most common ones that we see being implemented is newly formed franchisors having to have a risk factor to note that that brand is relatively young. The negative capitalization in the event the franchisor's equity is not sufficient to be able to perform the pre-opening obligations. Personal guarantees, requiring personal guarantees, spousal personal guarantees, minimum sales requirements, where the franchisor imposes a minimum sales requirement in order to retain the franchise, and then purchasing restrictions, where they are only allowed to buy products from designated sources. That is the last one that we see often being brought up. So in thinking about COVID and how it's impacted your system, it can impact items 1 through 4 of your FDD. Items 1 through 4 discusses the nature of your concept. And so you would, in item 1, how has your model changed? Is that description in item 1, is that still accurate? How has the marketplace changed? Your competitive framework, that may have changed as well. You're required in item 1 of the FDD to discuss the the regulations that impact your business. Those regulations are perhaps different than they were a year ago. In items 2, 3, and 4 of your FDD, we talk about the principal officers of the company. Have there been personnel changes that would require an amendment, or new lawsuits or administrative actions? And then bankruptcies. In the case of bankruptcies, it's important to get, and one of the things we do and with our clients every year is to make sure to get from each of those people listed in item 2 an updated bio to make sure that, and litigation and bankruptcy history to make sure there aren't any personal bankruptcies or otherwise that would have to be disclosed in the disclosure document. And so it's important to make sure to do that. Items 5 and 6. Do you have any changes in fees to promote development? Are you running any kind of incentives? Those, if you are and you're thinking about doing that, then those need to be listed in items 5 and 6 as the case may be. Consider developing a conversion program. You may have developed systems and processes that are such that this market is ripe for consolidation, where there may be independent operators operating in your sector who would appreciate the value of your brand and appreciate the infrastructure that you can help provide. And this may be a ripe opportunity to get those people to consider converting where they might not have historically thought about being part of a franchise system. And then whether or not your fees were uniformly applied during 2020, to the extent you made concessions and so forth, and those would need to be disclosed in item 20. In items 5 and 6 of the FDD as appropriate. So item 7 of the FDD. So your development cost, you need to look at those carefully and see have they changed at all as a result of COVID. For example, if you are having to put glass in front of the cash register, or otherwise having to implement COVID-related protections or increased use of personal protective equipment, to the extent those costs exist, those need to be addressed in the FDD. In turn, you may have savings to the extent that there has been a drop in demand for inventory, for example. Then there may be places that should be tweaked. It's important with regards to the PPE and model changes to include to footnote that you've considered whether that has occurred or not, to avoid comment letters from regulators asking if you have considered that in your process. And changes in your staffing model might also have reduced your item 7 cost. So item 8, changes in supply relationships. Are you requiring that they buy different products and so forth from approved suppliers as part of your COVID-related response? If so, those need to be addressed in item 8 potentially. Item 10, franchisor offered financing. To thinking strategically about growth. Are you willing to potentially defer or finance part of that initial franchise fee, or perhaps offer equipment financing or other financing? If you're not, or maybe even if you are, you need to still be developing relationships with SBA lenders and other funding sources, traditional non-SBA lenders, as well as 401k rollovers. If you're not already on the SBA franchise registry, you should consider doing that, as we talked about earlier with the PPP loan money. If you have franchisees who are wanting to take advantage of that, you're going to need your franchise offering to be listed on the franchise registry, and we most certainly can help you do that. The goal is to develop the financing options available to help you close sales, so that those are available, that you can take that off the table and when prospects are deciding whether or not they want to move forward with acquiring a franchise. Item 11. This is where you talk about the franchisor's obligations under the franchise agreement. So how has your development model changed? Do you need to travel? Does your franchise disclosure document speak that you're going to travel to approve real estate, or are you doing virtual approvals of real estate? How is that being done? Are you taking photographs of the real estate? What is it you're requiring in the way of a deliverable in order to approve that real estate if you're not actually going out there to look at it? Are you delivering a portion of your or all of your training virtually? That needs to be addressed in item 11 of your FDD. Have you changed required computer equipment to facilitate video conferencing, virtual check-in, mobile ordering, etc.? Those technology pieces need to be addressed in item 11, and they may be stale in your current disclosure document. So be thinking about that as you approach this renewal season. So the next topic is item 19, or financial performance representations. So at the state level, the state franchise laws are coordinated. Each state that may have their own franchise laws, but the states that are franchise registration states coordinate their activities through an organization called NASA, and it's not the NASA that puts people on the moon, but it's the North American Securities Administrators Association. So in June of 2020, NASA published guidance on how they wanted to address COVID-related financial performance representations. They had concern that franchisors were simply going to continue to use their 2019 financial performance representations as set forth in the FDDs that they had prepared in the first quarter of 2020 without regards to whether or not those financial performance representations were still valid when considering all of the circumstances and facts, including the actual performance of the units. Now, what we have seen is in some units, you have situations where they ended up removing their disclosures because they did not feel comfortable that whether or not they could stand behind those disclosures at that time, and went with just a no financial performance representation disclosure. Others amended their documents during the year, and others did the analysis and decided that they did not need to amend. And I suspect there are people out there who just either didn't know that they needed to look at that, or they were ostriches and just stuck their head in the sand and hoped that it would go away. But it's not going to go away, because if you've got a disclosure and you've got it in your amending document, you're going to need to be prepared to explain, if you haven't already through an amendment process, why you didn't make any change and why that 2019 number was still valid, because we do fully expect that states may raise this issue as part of comments if you have not made an amendment during the course of 2020. So the first question becomes, do you have a reasonable, so some franchisors will want to this year in 2021 include both their 2019 data and their 2020 data, because many franchisors, rightfully so, feel that the 2020 information was an anomaly and it does not reflect what their operational history would be under normal circumstances, because 2020 was anything but normal. So the answer here is that potentially you can do that. We just need to look at that data and see how it plays out when compared to 2020. So what we recommend is that you provide your counsel with 2019 and 2020 monthly data for those 2 years, and perhaps location specific or regional specific data, so that you can then determine how to best tell your story. As you know from reading the news and from your own experience, that the level of restrictions that have been imposed has varied radically state by state and perhaps even city by city within the country. And so it may be appropriate to consider making supplemental item 19 disclosures or regional disclosures to be able to quarter off sections of the country that were more restrictive than other sections of the country, so that you can show how your units have performed on a regional basis. And so the time and attention should be put into your item 19 this year to think about how to best tell your story. and whether or not then you can use the item 19 data as part of a discussion of 2019 data as part and parcel with the 2020 data will then be to reveal itself to you and your franchise attorney as you're working through this. So I don't know if you can see on the screen or not this slide, but what I was showing is a slide that shows how one might display their 2019 versus 2020 data in tabular form to show how the difference occurred on a month-to-month or quarter-to-quarter basis. So here, I took this from a franchise disclosure document that I was reviewing last week, and I thought it was a very interesting and intriguing way to present the sales data, to be able to show in graphical form how this particular system suffered a decline in sales after 2 months going into 2020. So this was a month by month basis. So how they were up during those first 2 months of the year. And then they obviously suffered a drop during March and April during the shutdowns, but then were able to begin their bounce back. And so I think using graphical representations, thinking outside the box of how you can illustrate that story is noteworthy, to be able, within the confines of the regulations applied to item 19, so that you can hopefully be able to tell that story of success that's being shown in this slide. Well, you might see it below the line and say, well, that's not success, but they're working their way and clawing their way back, and they're able to show what the trend line was over time. So in item 20 of your disclosure document, how has your unit count changed? Have you lost units? Are you able to preserve those units, as we were talking about using some of the strategies we talked about earlier? Will those units be that are closed, are they permanently closed, or are they temporarily closed? If they're temporarily closed, then we would just note that in a footnote, but so that we disclose it, but they would still remain part of your unit census versus those who are permanently closed. So it's important to know what the last act with each of those units is, and that we properly disclose that. Lastly, if we didn't have enough to throw at you today, now we're going to talk about your financial statements, your audited financial statements. Now, I am not an auditor, so I'm speaking as someone that has a background in accounting, but does not practice public accounting. But the item 21 of your FDD obviously is where you disclose your financial performance. Your audited financial statements. FASB, which is the Financial Accounting Standards Board, has changed its revenue recognition for private franchisors. But when I use the word change, it's not really a change. It's simply trying to get the auditors to properly apply the standards on how to recognize your initial franchise fee income. As you may know, we have had a problem the last few years as FASB has changed its financial accounting standards, that where they are trying to move to more principle-based approach to financial standards. And part of that was with regards to revenue recognition, and to get away from industry-specific requirements related to revenue recognition. The problem for franchising was that many auditors, being conservative as they are supposed to be, were being overly conservative and causing franchisors to just amortize that initial franchise fee over a 10-year period, if they had a 10-year agreement, without regards to the services and the value of the services that franchisors were providing. And many emerging brands were just saying, okay, well, I'll go along with it because I don't have the resources to prepare the documentation that the auditors were requiring them to produce to prove that they were in fact entitled to recognize that income immediately, because they were providing a lot of pre-opening services to their new franchisees, and that was all baked into the initial franchise fee. So finally, FASB stepped in and said, enough is enough. We're going to freeze the application of this starting in May of 2020, and we're going to come up with a solution that works for the franchise community, which, thanks to the International Franchise Association's lobbying efforts, they were successful in getting them to do. In December 2020, they voted to put forward and will most likely adopt in early 2021 what's called a practical expedient for non-public franchisors. The practical expedient is simply an alternate way to apply that test without having to change their rule. So private franchisors, both those who've already gone through the process of applying the standard and have resulted in deferral of that fee, they will be able to take advantage of that, as well as franchisors who had not already done so and were taking advantage of the deferral till 2021. This expedient will apply with one caveat, that is, as long as it's probable that the ongoing royalties will provide a sufficient revenue stream to cover support costs plus a reasonable profit. So if a franchisor has structured their system, which is very rare, but if they structured it to get a large initial franchise fee and then they have a nominal ongoing royalty, then they would not be able to take advantage of this. So as I said, it provides a simplified approach, because before, what one had to do was they had to value the services that were unique to their brand and not general business advice, and they had to value those, and then they would determine the value based on what it costs the franchisor to provide those services, and then would result in a residual initial franchise fee, and that portion was the part that was supposed to be amortized. And so what you had was auditors just skipping that step and just saying, oh, well, we're just going to amortize the whole thing. So now this expedient will say that you can account for those pre-opening services as a single pre-opening performance obligation and can recognize that revenue immediately once those services have been performed. So some examples are going to be site selection, training for franchisees and their personnel, facilities assistance. So if you're providing a standard set of plans, for example, that is already in documentation on how they get open. That's not expense that you're incurring every time, but you're going to get to recognize the value of that as provided to the franchisee in determining how much of this fee income that you're going to be able to recognize immediately. Preparing and distributing your operations manual. So again, you've got significant expense that you may have spent a lot of time and money, internal resources and external resources developing with consultants, developing those manuals. You're going to now be able to recognize the value of that is determined by the value to the franchisee, not the value of what it's costing you to deliver that to each franchisee. Inspection, quality control services. So thinking through, and what else? Yeah, this is not an exhaustive list. So what else are you providing in the way of pre-opening services? And as I said, that's going to be based on the value that they receive, not the cost that you deliver, which is going to be, you're going to have to do some homework to document what that would be worth. But like I said, in using an example of a standard set of plans, you know what you paid for those plans, and they would ostensibly have to pay for them each time that if they were opening their own business. So that value of those plans is there. And there's other ways to calculate that, which you should talk with your auditors as to how to do that. But the point is that that should result in a dramatically lower residual initial franchise fee, and most of that money being able to be recognized as income immediately. And it's important to note that those fees will actually get recognized as income as those services were provided. So it doesn't mean that all of the services have to be provided, but as the services are provided. And the nice thing about the way this practical expedient has been drafted is such that you will not have to withdraw your prior financial statements, which is very important as a franchisor, because that would have made it impractical for franchisors who have already adopted the legacy ASC 606 standard, because they would have had to potentially have to offer rescission and other things to those franchisees that have bought during 2020 as a result of those financial statements. That is not going to have to be the case. So you will be able to we understand that you'll be able to make an adjustment there on your 2020 statement to be able to adjust and then move forward on using the practical expedient standard. So what should you be doing now? You should be again discussing with your auditors now how this will be undertaken, evaluate the services you provide, what people do for you in exchange for those fees, so that you can determine the value that you're deriving, and determine which services, when those services are delivered in the process, so you can determine when you'll be able to recognize that income and be able to provide that information to your auditors. With that, Carly, do we have any questions?
We do. Last year, many states moved to issue like a standard comment in reviewing the FDD, whether that was an initial or renewal filing. They were questioning the intention to put in the franchisor's item 19 FPR. Do you think that you will see something similar this year?
Yes, I mean, I think that as we talked about a little bit earlier, that I would expect that we will see for franchisors who did not, particularly for those who did not have an amendment during the year, that we will see states such as Washington and New York questioning your analysis and why did you determine that you didn't need to amend last year, and why you have a basis for 2020. The good news for 2021, using the 2020 numbers, the good news is the 2020 numbers we now have a longer horizon of your story, so we're able to I think make that argument so much more compelling.
All right, thank you. That wraps up the questions that we have right now. If other people have questions regarding the information that Ritchie presented, please contact us and we'll be happy to discuss them with you. Thank you again, Ritchie, and thanks for everybody else for attending our webinar today, which is the 2021 FDD Update Strategies for a COVID World. In the coming days, you will receive a follow-up email with a shareable link to view a recording of today's program. So on behalf of all of us at Manning Fulton, thanks for joining us today, and thank you, Ritchie, for this excellent presentation. We hope you all have a fantastic day.